and we're just very, very, very happy and pleased to welcome Rabbi Jeremy Weider, Rosh Yeshiva, Yeshiva Rabbeinu Yitzchak Elchanan, to be with us this morning to discuss the topic of when to correct the Baal Kriya.
Begin today by speaking about two aspects of correcting Kriyas HaTorah, and in this regard, I guess I wear two different hats. One question that has to be addressed is a question that's really not a question that you would necessarily ask a Rav, but you would ask a Baal Mikra, someone who's an expert in the Hebrew language and an expert in Tanakh. And the second kind is a question that you would ask someone as a Rav. The Noda B'Yehuda, very early in his Tshuvas in Arach Chaim, I think in Madura Kama, was asked a few simple grammar questions. And his first response, interestingly enough, and you're talking about someone who's probably the Gadol Hador, certainly in Central Europe in the 18th century, Noda B'Yehuda responded first by saying, "I'm not really sure why they sent me this question. They should have sent these questions to Bali Mikra." He goes on to answer them because he thought they were Aleph-based questions, but I think the point is still very important that in terms of determining one of the things we're going to talk about, changing of meaning, very frequently that's a question that has to be addressed not by the Rav, but unless the Rav is also the expert in Mikra. With regards to what situations you correct, and so that is more of a standard psak question. Now, in terms of the positions of Rishonim, there are three positions in terms of when one corrects Kriyas HaTorah. The first position, quoted by the Tur in the name of the Manhig, is that you don't correct, that's the one that's not on the sheets, you don't correct a Baal Kriya when he makes a mistake because you don't want to embarrass him. There's an issue of Kavod HaBrios here. It's a very interesting Yerushalmi that this Shita is based upon. We make reference to this in at least the Ashkenazic Hineni before Musaf on Yomim Noraim, where we say Vihena di Lugenu Alecha Ava, which is a play based upon, it's funny because it's a reversal of the letters, of V'diglo Alaya Hava, that di Lugenu, even when we make errors, HaKadosh Baruch Hu loves it. So someone who reads Aharon as Haran, or other kinds of misreading, so HaKadosh Baruch Hu loves it anyway. That's the first sheet that's quoted. The Aruch HaShulchan in his discussion points out that he doesn't think that shita really makes a lot of sense in the context of a tzibur. A private individual who reads that way, that is truly something that Kadosh Baruch Hu loves. But in the context of the kriya of the tzibur, so that's something that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. There are the other two shitos, and that sheet is not quoted in the Shulchan Aruch, are cited by the Mechaber, and it's on the source sheet in Siman Kuf Mem Beis. The Mechaber writes, "Kara b'tah afilu b'diktuk achas machzir noso." And this is based upon the sheet of the Rambam, that if a person makes even the slightest error in the kriya, Mechaber makes no distinction between whether it has an effect upon the meaning or has no effect upon the meaning. So, machzir noso. And it requires clarification what machzir noso means. There are two terms that are going to be used. One is machzir noso, which means even if they put the Sefer Torah away, or even if they've gone on to other aliyos, you still come back and you make them go back, no matter how far. Now, you don't always have to repeat the entire parsha, but certainly it means even after you've moved on, you still have to go back. The Ramah is going to use a term goar in bo, which means that you scream at the Baal Kriya on the spot. The difference between goar bo, machzir and oso, is that if you missed your opportunity to pick on the Baal Kriya when he made a minor mistake, so you don't have to go back afterwards. But machzir oso doesn't mean that you correct them on the spot. It means much more than that. It means that later you would go back and you would make him repeat even after you were 6 aliyahs down the road. The Ramah says, "V'chein din hachazan hakores." The Ramah points out something which we wouldn't even think about when you first read the Mechaber, Karavata, we're thinking about the Baal Kriya, but the Ramah points out we're not talking about the Baal Kriya, we're talking about the Ola. If the Ola makes a mistake, and the Ramah says it's not only true about the Ola, it's even true when we have the setup that most of us have today, which is the Baal Kriya reads the entire Parsha, and people just make the brachas. The Ramah says the din is the same, but now the Ramah adds one caveat. He says, it's only if it changes the inyan, it changes the meaning. If you made an error in the Trope, benikud, or in the vocalization, so you don't make him go back. You do rebuke him on the spot. You make some type of correction. I think the basic point that's accomplished by it is that it's supposed to be read properly in the first place. So on the spot, it's not so much of a tircha to make the person repeat it and change the word. Once you've gone on, it's a tircha tzibura to make him go back and delay everything. But on the spot, why not? The person's supposed to read it properly. Neither the Mechaber nor the Ramah, I think, are particularly concerned about the Kavod HaBrios issue. The question, I don't think it's stated explicitly. My assumption is it's a tircha tzibura question. So the Ramah says, in such cases, if a person errs in Trope or in the Nikudos, so then you don't make him go back. Now the Mishnah Berurah here already points out, I think, what is obvious, that certainly Nikudos, it's fairly obvious that frequently when you change the Nikud, you will actually change the meaning. The Ramah is saying that in most cases, the Trope doesn't change the meaning, and in many cases, the Nikudos don't change the meaning either. So if a person said Kesef instead of Kosef at the end of a pasuk, or he said Yishmeru instead of Yishmoru, or vice versa, he hasn't changed the meaning even though he's changed the Nikud. And therefore, the Ramah says it's not necessary to be machzir the person, but nonetheless, one can be goer bo. Now, the Mishnah Berurah here writes, in this vein, in the underlined portion, he says, "V'nokat negina v'nikod mishum da'alpi rov ein ha'inyan mishtana el yadam." Most of the time, it doesn't change the meaning. U'v'nikod nami im ira she'inyan nishtana al yidei zeh kigon ya'aseh b'patach kara ye'oseh b'tzerei o lehifuch. Oh, b'chalav b'chataf kara, he read b'chalev kara b'chelev b'tzerei. Oh, yoshev and yoshav b'chol kayotze b'zeh. While the Mishnah Berurah, it's a little bit odd, he doesn't say b'ta'amim, I think it's fairly obvious that the same thing would apply to Trope. He may have been more pressed to find examples of Trope that changed the meaning, but I will give several examples later where I think that's very clear. Now, there is another kind of error which doesn't change the meaning at all, and nonetheless, one still has to correct. The Bir Halacha writes, and this is the first of the two, it's an error in one letter. Even if you leave out a word, even though it doesn't change the meaning, and he gives a good example, this week's parasha, yesterday's parasha, and obviously the pronoun ani is implied in the verb hichbadti anyway. So lo yatzav. Tzarich lachzar the lo niskar b'shum makom b'chiser teva she'chiluk ben ishtana in Allah. So there are really two kinds of errors. There are errors which change the meaning of what's being read, and then there are errors that you simply didn't read what was there or read something that wasn't there. I suspect that words such as kesef and keves falls into the same category. Even though the words even mean the same thing, they're probably linguistically related. Nonetheless, they're two different words. The person read one instead of the other. It's something that, according to even the Rabbah, one would be machzir the person after the fact. Now, there are questions and issues that I'm not sure about. I don't know how commonly they come up. I've heard some of these, and I've wondered, people have asked me, and I'm not sure. What happens when you have a word that you completely mispronounce the accent on, but it doesn't necessarily change the meaning? I will talk about examples where it does clearly change the meaning, but you take, once someone looked at me after someone read Korach or something like that, and it doesn't change the meaning. It's a name. The question is, are you talking about two different people or not? I don't know. My assumption in that case is that you probably don't have to be machzir. It's probably in the category, it's in neither category. It's not nishtana inyan, and it's not a completely different word. When it comes to nekudos, probably the same thing, even in situations where it doesn't change the meaning. I suspect that should be treated as being the same word with just a minor error, and it falls into the Ramah's category of goer and bo, and not machzir and oso. The question was about the words mitame and mitame, or a better example, I don't know if you have that, where you have mitaher and mitaher. So those two words have different meanings. A mitaher is the one who is purifying. A mitaher is from the binyan ispile. It's mistaher, and you have an assimilation of the tuf. So that's a case where you would definitely correct. Although in that case, right, there are two ways to get that word right, either with the vowel or with the dagish chazak, which is not so common, read in the test. Now, I think that one might argue, I feel there are some exceptions to the rule, the Ramah's rule and the Chaber's rule, machzir and oso. I think there are a couple of circumstances in which one may take a less stringent approach to correcting. especially to the Ramah's position of Gor and Bo when it hasn't changed the meaning, but I think even when it has changed the meaning. And those two circumstances are, number one, a bar mitzvah boy, where even though the standards for bar mitzvah boy theoretically are the same for every Baal Kriya, and one might even question the wisdom of forcing 13-year-old boys to get up there and have to read. But that said, since we are forcing them to get up there, in effect, I think that one has to really use a different standard, and I think the issue of kavod habrios becomes not only one of kavod habrios, but potentially having a very formative impact upon a child, not only in terms of his own avoda in the future of participating, which is necessary in order to have Baalei Kriya for the future, but I think even in terms of his Yiddishkeit, I think one has to take a very, very gentle line. And there are it's a question of priorities. Mitzad Hilchos Kriyas HaTorah, I think it's pretty clear. You have to correct mitzad pikuach nefesh, and nefesh has multiple meanings. I think that one may take a different line. The second situation, somewhere in between, but again, I think that there's something to be said about a softer line, is the situation in Batei Knesses where you don't have Baalei Kriya who can do it, and you have one individual who, especially if he's unpaid, who really is taking upon himself to do it for the tzibur. I think that one has to be a little more sensitive in that case as well. I happen to come from a shul where we are very fortunate, I see at least one of them here, to have some very outstanding Baalei Kriya, and my feeling is that when a person gets up there, unless he's a bar mitzvah boy, and wants the lane, he to some extent is putting himself on the line, because if he doesn't do a proper job, he's a hedyot hakofetz barosh. When there are gedolim v'tovim mimenu, and he wants to do it anyway, kol hakavod, but you better do a very good job. But I think there are many situations, many Batei Knesses that don't have that luxury, and I think that a greater degree of sensitivity has to be shown. Who should be correcting is also a very important point, and I think this touches more upon the kavod habrios issue. I think that Rabbanim, I've never been in this position being in the pulpit, I think it's generally a good idea for the Rav to appoint someone, to designate someone to be the corrector in the shul. For two reasons. One is he's probably sometimes busy with other things during Kriyas HaTorah, and the second is that being a corrector doesn't make one very popular. Gamano shlat tzadik lo tov, and Rabbanim have enough things to do that earn them enemies. This doesn't have to be one of them, and someone else can fill in the role equally as well as the Rav, assuming there is someone who's as qualified, not on the rabbinic aspect, but on the question of knowledge of the Hebrew language and knowledge of Tanakh. I think that it's also important to pick someone who is benachas im habrios, someone who is liked, someone who's not going to be viewed as a kantaran, because that doesn't really make for good relationships, and that doesn't make people very happy. That can be a great source of machlokas. And the final note I would make in this context, in terms of the person who corrects, is to have someone up there, have the person up there on the bima. He can be the Gabbai Sheni or accompany the Gabbai Sheni, and he can correct quietly. There is no need for there to be a chorus from the tzibur screaming out. I found as a general rule, when you hear a chorus from the tzibur, they're usually correcting on things that at least certainly don't qualify in machzirno, so maybe they fit. I know that the tzibur is has a great degree of islavus for the Ramah's Goarimbo, but given again all the things that cause machlokas in a shul, I think that the Ge'ara can be left to the one person who's standing on the side who can do it nicely. Now, with the sensitivity to kavod habrios shown, at the same time, I think there has to be a consideration. Again, it all depends, lefi hamakom, lefi hazman, what resources are available. But in terms of training Baalei Kriya to prepare properly, the one source about Baalei Kriya preparing properly, explicitly in the context of Kriyas HaTorah, that I'm aware of is a Medrash Tanchuma, which is cited by Tosfos on Lamed Aleph and Beis in Megillah. It's the last facing pages of Megillah, and it quotes based upon a pasuk in Eov, the three verbs that a Baal Kriya is supposed to read the parsha go over 3 times before. Aside from any chiyuv shnai mikra targum, Baal Kriya has to do it at least one more time. And I would say that for most starting Baalei Kriya, and even people experienced Baalei Kriya have read, probably even doing it a few more times than 3 is not a bad thing to do. I think the attitude that one approaches Kriyas HaTorah with is also very, very important. There is I guess I find it disturbing, again, maybe it speaks to the context in which I see things, or maybe the way I look at the world, that today there's a great emphasis placed upon participation. And I don't wish to diminish the importance of participation, of giving people a very tangible connection to Yiddishkeit, but I don't think it should come at the expense of a proper avodas Hashem. There is a Gemara in Chelek, we've spoken about kavod habrios, and kavod habrios is one value. On the other hand, we know that a shliach tzibur shatah is siman ra l'sholchav, and we also know the Gemara in Chelek, which speaks about the story of Pilegesh Begiva. And if you read the story of Pilegesh Begiva, it's a little bit funny that the Bnei Yehuda asked the Urim V'Tumim a couple of times whether or not they should go up and fight, and the Urim V'Tumim says Yehuda Yaleh, that Yehuda should go up first, and they get slaughtered at the hands of Bnei Binyamin. And only the third time they ask, and then Alei u'machar tenu biyadecha. Now I'll hand them over tomorrow. And Chazal were troubled. Why did God? Okay, so technically God was off the hook because He didn't promise to make them succeed. He just told them to go. But why did God do this? And Chazal have a line that always resonates with me, that they were punished because of Pesel Micha. Because for hundreds of years Pesel Micha was there, and no one uttered a voice of protest. And one woman was mutilated or was abused, and all of a sudden everybody was up in arms. Al kavodi lo mechisem, al kvod basar v'dam mechisem. The sense that at the same time as we're worried about kavod habrios, there also has to be a concern about kavod shemayim. And it doesn't mean that everybody has to be a perfect Baal Kriya when they get up there, but that minimally there has to be an assumption that when people are going to lane, they are going to put in the time to prepare, and they're going to put in the time to improve. In such a case, I think we can be a little more understanding and a little bit more tolerant. But in situations where people have a feeling that they have a right, this is their right, and they don't need to adhere or to strive to improve their standards towards the Halachic l'chatchila, I think it's better not to have people in that situation reading rather than to have them up there and to have to be correcting them. Now, that's as far as the halacha or the halachos of correcting. I wanted to turn my attention now to two areas. One is to point out several examples where things that we would ordinarily regard as minor may actually be very major. And the examples that I have here are a very small sampling of examples that I've encountered or I've recorded. But some of them are typical. Some of the examples you may encounter explicitly discussed in the Rishonim, such as even Rashi. Sometimes Rashi just says it b'havla. You have to realize what he's actually driving at. The first example, I want to first give examples of situations where the accent changes the meaning of a word. The first example on the sheet is v'zacharti versus v'zacharti. Now, this particular form is a vav. Sometimes a vav is a vav achibor, and sometimes a vav is a vav hahipoch. A vav achibor v'zacharti, the normal accent is zacharti, I remembered, v'zacharti, and I remembered. But when you want to put the vav hahipoch on the front and change the meaning to I will remember, v'zacharti lahem bris rishonim, so the usual form is to shift the accent to the last syllable. There are some exceptions to the rule, lamed yud verbs or lamed hey verbs in the kal, like ve'asisi, ve'asisa, the accent doesn't shift, but as a general rule, the accent does shift. And if a person has placed the accent in the wrong place, he has changed the meaning of the word. In fact, he has completely reversed it. A second very common class of verbs where accent shifts change the meaning are in lamed yud verbs, or lamed, they're sometimes called lamed hey verbs, where you have a word like shavu and a word like shavu. If you look, if I'm not mistaken, Rashi in Parshas Vayishlach on the word shavu vayavozu, I think he writes lashon shivya. He doesn't comment anything further than that. But that's the havla. What Rashi's really telling you is that the accent is milarah. It's on the last syllable, because if the accent were on the first syllable, shavu, and by the way, this is in that pasuk, it's a very plausible reading. It could mean they went back and they plundered, but that's not how the Balei Masorah transmitted the accentuation. It's shavu, they took captive vayavozu and they plundered, not shavu, they returned. Shavu is from the root shin vav beis, shavu is from the root shin beis yud. So you have a bunch of verbs like that. Shasu and shasu. Shasu is they placed, shin yud taf, shin vav taf. Shasu is they drank. And you have both. You have lo shasu ished yoalav coming up in a few weeks in Parshas Kisisa, and you have the word, you do have the word shasu as well, which means that they drank. Banu and banu. One means to build, one is a preposition, banu, amongst us. So you have a lot of, those happen not to be verbs, but it looks just like this. So as a general rule, this is another category of accents that change the meaning. Finally, the one that's obviously most familiar, it's from the same family of ayin vav verbs, the word ba'a and ba'a. And here, Rashi already points out in a number of places in Chumash that when you have the accent mila'el, ba'a, that is most people call a past tense of the verb. When you have the accent milara, ba'ah, that's what's known as a participle of the present tense. And that, again, changes the meaning. There are a lot of examples of this, shava and shava, and so on. Examples of Trope that changes the meaning. And I should sort of, as Hakdama, point out that Trope plays three roles. Number one, it provides music. Number two, it provides an accent in most cases. And number three, the one that's sort of least known, but I think it's obvious when you sit down and think about it, is that it provides commaization, if I can make up the word. It provides the punctuation in the sentence, not just esnachta and sof pasuk, which everybody knows, but it even breaks it down further. For those who are really interested in reading, it's very, very, you can either read the whole book or you can read the first chapter. It's very dense, but if you're already intimately familiar with Kriyas HaTorah, you might be able to manage. With Breuer's Ta'amei HaMikra, which probably I suspect is still in print, has the first chapter as a summary of the book, and he lays out the rules for how you break up, how the commas break down a pasuk. It usually works. There are places where it doesn't work so well, but on the whole it works. If you want to see a very broad description, a very thorough description of how the Trope works. There are some obvious situations where switching the Trope switches the meaning. Now, sometimes there are in fact multiple possible readings, but I believe from a halachic perspective that which the Baalei Masorah recorded is the one that is considered authoritative. There may have been multiple readings within Chazal, within Rishonim, but that's the one we accept. The first one here, we have Arami Oved Avi, and this is why it's very famous. The Baalei Masorah here have adopted the reading that the Baal Haggadah also adopts, and we all know it from the Haggadah, from the Medrash Halacha on Arami Oved Avi, that Bikesh Lavan Lakar Sakol, reading Arami tried to destroy my father. It's a funny verb, but that's how the Baal Haggadah read it. That's how the Baalei Masorah placed the Trope. They put Arami, because a tipcha is a pashta is a mafsik, and then Oved Avi. But if you look at Ibn Ezra, his understanding of Arami Oved Avi is that a wandering Aramean was my father, which means that the Trope should have been, for Ibn Ezra's reading, Arami Oved, mapach pashta, and then followed by Avi. Now here, I would say that even though Ibn Ezra's reading may be viable, the authoritative reading is that of the Baalei Masorah, and that's a correctable mistake. Achi Yefes HaGadol, this one I really like because Rashi, there are probably 10 to 20 places throughout Chumash where Rashi makes appeal to the Trope as proof for interpretation, but for some reason here he never bothers to appeal to the Trope to prove his point, even though the Trope happened to follow Rashi's interpretation. The question is it Achi Yefes HaGadol? Was Shem the older brother of Yefes, or was it Achi, the brother of Yefes HaGadol? Now Rashi adopts, based upon putting different psukim together in the ages, that Shem was the younger brother. It was Achi Yefes HaGadol. In this case, the Trope that we have reflects that interpretation. It's a tipcha, mercha sof pasuk, and therefore that's in accordance. That has one meaning. If you reverse the mercha tipcha, which is a very, very common error that Baalei Kriya who don't prepare properly make, you not always, but frequently you can change the meaning. I would say that if there's no alternative way of reading it, it doesn't matter in terms of having to be machzir if they reverse the mercha tipcha. But there are cases where you really have to watch out for that, which includes the next one. Hamidbar hagadol hazeh. Is it the desert of this great one? It belonged to some person, hagadol hazeh, or is it Hamidbar hagadol hazeh? Is it the desert? Is it this great desert? And depending upon where, again, you put the mercha tipcha, you will change the meaning. Another well-known example of this, where Rashbam attacks his grandfather and says he doesn't know anything about Tameh HaMikra, is Miteref B'ni Alisa. So that's one. So this is another, many examples of that. I would close with one other example, shvanaz and shvanachs, which are also very important. And in this context, there are, again, can be very subtle things that change the meaning. One coming up in this week's parsha, it's not on the sheet, Vayiru ha'am es Hashem, vayaminu b'Hashem. That's correctable error. Vayiru means then they saw, Vayiru, even without the long chirik, but certainly a shvana means and they feared. Chochma and chachama, whether you have, again, a shvanach, it also depends upon the kamatz, can either mean wisdom or she became wise. And there are numerous examples of this. Now, of course, one question, I'll conclude with this, which some people are going to be left with is, how do you figure this out on the spot? And I will tell you, I even know one very big Baal Medachtek, who's certainly a bucky in grammar, who frequently comes to me, not that I would do any better, comes to me afterwards and either says, usually he says, should I have corrected? Sometimes he said, should I not have corrected? This is, again, one more reason why I think that a Rav should have somebody, if he has a Bible professor in the shul, it always helps, or somebody who's certainly an expert in biblical Hebrew, but someone who might, A, take the time to prepare, and B, have his job solely designated as doing that, so at least he has half a shot of correcting as needed. But Silva, I would conclude by stating that the position I think that's generally accepted is that we're not machzir like the Mechaber, we're machzir only like the Ramah. And I suspect, even though technically the Ramah says goar in bo, I suspect the Minhag Yisrael is that we don't correct even on the spot unless it actually changes the meaning. But certainly if one were to adopt the position of goar in bo, it would be a halachically legitimate position. Yes. You don't have a v'zacharti. That word doesn't appear in the Torah. The question was, is there a v'zacharti? Where is that word from? It's not a common form to have a regular vav with a past verb. It usually would be va'ezkar. But if you look, you have a few like that. V'ochalti chatos hayom, which is the accent is milael because it's and had I eaten today. You probably do. I'm trying to think. You have in Koheles a number of verbs. I don't remember if there's one that's identical to word that we have in the Torah, but I think there is. If you look, you want to find a bunch of forms where you'll get bizachartis, and you'll find one that overlaps. With regards to correcting the Haftarah, I think Medina. This is not really an issue I've seen discussed, but Medina, it should be corrected the same way as Kriyas HaTorah. The Minhag Yisrael seems to me to be not to. I suspect probably because the Haftarah was originally a takana in place of Kriyas HaTorah when they couldn't read it and therefore sort of regarded as an orphan. But technically speaking, a Haftarah is supposed to be read out of a cloth, although we don't. You can already see the element of treating it more as a b'diavad there. And the same, my sense is that people choose not to, for the most part, to correct people reading the Haftarah. The question was about Psukim Shein Hechreh. There's a Gemara in Yoma Daf Nun Beis which states that the Chamish Mikro Shein Hechreh, except that in at least three of those cases, the Pshuto Shemikra, it's clear what the Hechreh is. I don't really understand fully why Chazal were Mesupak. And I would say that, however, the Baalei Masorah Machriya, that is the Hachra. So our texts have Hachra, and that's the one that should be followed. Yes. The question is, what is the difference between the Shvana and the Chata Patach? And according to Rabbi Weider, the answer really is nothing. The real question that comes up for Baalei Kriya is what do you do with those funny Chata Patachs like Rivavos or Yitzchak and the like? Rabbi Weider claims, and it's printed in some of the Chumashim, he claims that if you look among the Baalei Masorah, the Masoretic codices, they either wrote a Shvana typically, or they wrote a Chata Patach instead of a Shvana. But he believes, and most people I know in the business who've thought about it tend to follow Rabbi Weider for the most part. Assume that unless it's on a guttural letter, and I'm not including Reish in that, you read it as you almost always read it as a Shvana, not as Chata Patach. But the fact that it's Chata Patach there tells you the word like Yitzchak, which without any indication you would have read the tzadi, you read the shva as a shvanach, so that should be read as a shvanach.
This is the last question that came in over the web. If the rabbi of the shul corrects the Baal Kriya from his seat, should the Gabbai repeat the correction to be sure it's heard, to be sure that the Baal Kriya heard it, or is that sufficient?
I think that the question is whether or not if the Rav calls out a correction from his seat, whether or not the Gabbai should repeat it for the Baal Kriya. I think that's a Metzias question. If the Rabbi has a loud enough voice and he scares the Baal Kriya enough, so then no need to. If the Baal Kriya doesn't catch it, so then I think the Gabbai can use the sense and correct.